Charles Tannock, why Sahel and why Sahel now?
Well, Sahel is a very important part of Africa. A few years ago, very few people in the political classes knew where Sahel was, but everybody was aware 2 years ago when there was an attempt by Al-Qaeda to take over Mali, which resulted in a French-led international force to invade the country and liberate the north and re-establish the rule from Bamako, the capital. So that really raised the issue of the Sahel in terms of becoming destabilized by a mixture of international terrorism, organized crime, people trafficking, and terrible human rights abuses which have gone on for a very, very long time. The Sahel is the band of countries which stretches across from west to east, near the Sahara and in the Sahara, and includes Mauritania on the west, which has a problem, for instance, of slavery. There is still slavery there, even though it was made illegal 20 years ago, and it's been fought against by the government, but it still exists. Right the way through Niger, where there are other problems to do with female genital mutilation, for instance, to countries like Burkina Faso. And also my report was about conditions and human rights, particularly the issue of access to resources for the Western Sahara, Sahrawi people, which is an area occupied by Morocco, and the conditions in the refugee camps in Algeria in Tindouf. That was one of the most controversial issues, whether or not, for instance, the EU should have a fishing agreement with Morocco without being absolutely certain that enough of this money from the EU was going to help the Sahrawi people, the Sahrawi fishermen. That was voted out of the report today in the plenary. But of course, there are EU missions to Mali now. There is a whole training mission for the armed forces. There is a mission to Niger as well to stabilize Niger, where there is a uranium mine, which if it fell into the hands of terrorists would be very dangerous. And there are lots of issues about corruption, women's rights, things like female genital mutilation, forced marriages. There are issues to do with democracy, lack of democracy, transparency. And so it is a vital part of the world. It's not very far away from Europe. It's nearer than, say, Somalia. And we don't want to see in Mali another Somalia.
Charles Tannock, about Sahel. Is it a byproduct, this unrest in Sahel, of the Arab Spring?
Well, no, but it's interesting that the intervention in Libya, which occurred shortly before, resulted in many, many small arms coming to jihadi terrorists, partly funded by certain players like Qatar and Saudi Arabia. All these arms, unfortunately, were bought and supplied to the opposition to Gaddafi, and some of them went south to the Sahel, particularly to Mali, where they rapidly fell into the hands of Al-Qaeda of the Islamic Maghreb and Mujao, and that destabilized Mali. So inevitably what happens further to the north in the Maghreb has an effect on what's happening in that central band. And of course it's particularly interesting as well for British MEPs like me, because in Nigeria we have the terrible attacks by Boko Haram. There is evidence now that Boko Haram, who are these jihadi terrorists in Nigeria, have links with all these Al-Qaeda-linked groups across the Sahel, all the way to Somalia, to Al-Shabaab, where you remember a couple of weeks ago that terrible attack in Kenya when they killed so many people in the shopping mall in Nairobi. So my report focused on a number of issues: fighting international terrorism, organized crime, weapons smuggling, people trafficking, forced marriages, slavery, believe it or not, in the modern world, and of course the whole issue, contentious issue, divisive issue regarding Western Sahara, how we can bring some kind of agreement and peaceful solution to that very long-standing territorial dispute as to whether or not Western Sahara should be autonomous or independent from Morocco.
What do you think? It should be autonomous or independent? What is your personal view? And how can we finally reach peace? What is your vision?
Well, I don't have an official position publicly as to what the outcome should be for the Western Sahara. I have a support and sympathy for the right to self-determination. That is in the UN resolutions regarding Western Sahara. Those resolutions also demand and call for a referendum which has never happened. Well, you have to ask the Moroccans that question. There's been repeated efforts to have the referendum. It's never happened. And we have these refugee camps still, after 40 years in Tindouf in Algeria. There's a danger of more unrest in the camps. And so clearly raising democracy, human rights, and I welcome the way that the Moroccan government has moved through the Arab Spring forces towards a more democratic environment, and certainly much more efforts to observe fundamental human rights. But of course, until they settle this whole issue of Western Sahara, and it may well be that the Sahrawis are prepared to accommodate some kind of maximum devolution from Rabat, it may be that they will ultimately demand and insist on their independence. But this is an issue which is a UN process. My report focused on their right to self-determination, at the same time recognize the issue of territorial integrity, but demanding the highest standards of human rights and the right to respect even those Sahrawis who are calling for independence. They have a right to say that, provided it's peaceful and there's no resort to violence.
Thank you very much, Charles Tannock.
My pleasure.